Hello, good morning, good afternoon to you all. Welcome to the SBTi Summit Gardens launch event. My name is Ligia. I'm part of the SBTi team. I work as a regional lead for Latin America, and I'll be hosting this webinar today. We are very, very glad to be here with you today in this milestone for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, when we launch the guidance for companies in the cement sector to set 1.5C aligned science-based targets for the first time. This is a project that we started October last year, and that is now ready to be launched. So please feel very welcome to this webinar. And I think I need the next slide, please. Thank you. So before we start, I would like to share some guidelines with you for today. So this is a Zoom webinar. It means that your camera and your mics are automatically muted. We invite you to send your questions via the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. We have a great team trying to answer all your questions throughout this webinar. And the slides will be also shared after this call, so there is no need to worry about the slides. This event is also being recorded, and we will also share the recording after the event. And I'm very glad to share that this webinar is being translated into Spanish. So for those that want to listen to the event in Spanish, please click in this interpretation button in the bottom of your screen, and you will be directed to the interpretation room where our colleague is translating into Spanish. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I think, okay, so I would like to walk you through the agenda for today. But before that, I think we have a set of polls now. So I don't know if the team can help. Oh, yes. So we have a quick poll here for you today with 4 questions. So we would be very glad if you could answer all of them to get to know us, to know you a little bit better. And while you answer these questions, I will walk you through the agenda for today. So now we are in this welcoming and introduction moment. Right after, I will invite Alberto Carrillo to introduce us to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And right after, we will have Carl Danway sharing us the guidance for the cement sector to set 1.5C aligned targets. And we will finish this first part of the webinar with Antonio Carrillo from Holcim, who will share the company's case study in setting their science-based targets. In the second part of the webinar, we will have a Q&A section. And then, so in this Q&A section, we will try to answer your questions live. And then we will have some closing remarks before we end this webinar. So next slide, please. And perfect. So let me introduce you to the great team that we have here today. So I'm very glad to have Alberto Carrillo, who is the Chief Technical Officer of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. He's in charge of our technical department. We also have Carl Danway, who is the Sector Technical Manager and also the team lead for buildings, steel, and cement. So the person who has led this work that will be presented today. We are very glad to also have Antonio Carrillo from Holcim. He is the head of climate and energy group sustainability at the company. Holcim is a key founder of this project, so very happy to have the company here represented by Antonio. This morning we have my colleague Zenico hosting the event, and now you are here with me. I'm Ligia, I'm the regional lead for Latin America, and we also have 2 great colleagues that have been done a lot throughout this whole project, that are Paulina Moreno, Communications Manager at the SBTi, and also Mirka, Project Officer of the SBTi. And we also have some SBTi colleagues that are behind the scenes and answering your questions in the Q&A. So to you all, thank you so much for making this day possible. And I think now we can go to the poll results. Let me see if I can see them. Okay, here they are. Thank you. So the first one is, what type of organization do you represent? And here the majority is companies, followed by consulting firms. Okay, so we have still room from academia and government representatives to join. Let me check the second one. So where is your organization based? We have lots of people from North America, followed by Europe and South America. And just reminding you that this event is also being translated into Spanish. So if you want to listen to it in Spanish, please choose the interpretation button in the bottom of your screen. Third one, what is the status of your company with respect to the SBTi? Let me check. So we have, my organization has committed to set a science-based target. And second one, my organization is considering committing to set a science-based target. But the majority of the answers are not applicable because I'm not representing a company. Interesting. So I think you guys are from consultancies, but supporting companies. So please stay tuned today. And the last, we have, what is the area you are most interested in with regard to the SEMEN science-based target setting guidance and tool? So first of all is understanding how science-based target setting work. Okay, so I think we will have plenty of time to explain this to you. So I think I need the next slide, please. Okay, so I will now hand it over to Alberto Carrillo, who will introduce us to the SBTi. Alberto, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And also thanks to the team that prepared this webinar, to the team that prepared this guidance, and also to Holcim that supported this project. My name is Alberto Carrillo. I'm Chief Technical Officer for the SBTi. And as Leah mentioned, I want to provide a brief overview about the Science-Based Targets Initiative as a context of the discussion about the guidance that we're launching today. View the next slide, please. So start with the Science-Based Targets Initiative is the body that is enabling the adoption and implementation of ambitious emission reduction targets in line with climate science in the corporate sector and in the financial sector. The initiative is a collaboration between 4 organizations and the Women Business Coalition, CDP, UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF. Yeah, we've been developing a number of resources to enable the adoption of science-based targets in the corporate sector, which I'm going to explain in the next few slides. View the next one, please. In terms of what we do as initiative, there's 4 key areas that inform our day-to-day work. The first one, connected to what we are announcing today, is the development of standards, guidance, and technical resources that enable companies and financial institutions to set climate targets that are consistent with the latest climate science. The second one is we work through a number of mechanisms and a number of partners to drive the adoption of science-based climate targets and to really scale up and mainstream the adoption of science-based targets in the real economy and in the financial sector. The third key piece of what we do is we provide independent assessment of climate targets to make sure that these targets adhere to the criteria that are available through SBTi standards and to best practice. And finally, we work also to embed science-based target setting and science-based ambition in the wider ecosystem in other parts of the climate action ecosystem. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the conceptual framework that companies in the SBTi follow, so this is basically described in detail in our net zero standard that was released about a year ago. And basically, this is based, of course, on the concept of net zero globally that was largely discussed by the IPCC in the special report on 1.5 degrees launched in 2018 and also in the sixth assessment report released earlier this year. And from this report, and I would say what we have as a global scientific consensus is that we need to reach net zero emissions globally in order to stabilize the increase in global temperature. We need to reach this point of net zero emissions at the global level by 2050 if we are to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And if we explore what this means for different parts of the economy, basically what it means is that we need to bring down emissions to zero or to residual levels across most sectors and activities in the economy. And so this is what we expect companies to commit. And in terms of how this is structured in the SBTi net zero standard, basically there's 4 key elements. The first one is basically a short-term target, a target that basically covers the next 5 to 10 years, where companies set targets to reduce emissions in line with a trajectory that brings us to net zero by 2050. And this is, of course, what is most critical and most urgent this decade. Then the second component of a science-based net zero target is a long-term commitment to reach a level of emissions that is consistent with the decarbonization needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And for most activities in the economy, this means reaching zero emissions. For other activities, it is expected there's going to be a small level of residual emissions. And this is, of course, described in emission pathways, and that is the basis that we use to inform also long-term targets in the SBTi. The third element is basically something that we encourage all companies to do, which is to contribute to the transition to net zero beyond the value chain of a company, beyond the specific boundaries of the business model of a company. And this is with the idea of scaling up the amount of finance available to go through this transition, but also to meet some of the other social and environmental goals, including, for instance, biodiversity conservation. And the fourth element is for those activities and those sectors where it is expected there's going to be an amount of residual emissions, to make sure that companies neutralize these emissions through the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. All of these 4 elements together is basically what companies commit in the SBTi through the net zero standard, and what is described in more detail in the guidance that we are releasing today for the cement value chain. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the accountability model that we have in the SBTi, this is basically the journey that companies follow. Normally, companies start with a commitment to set a science-based target. And once companies commit, they go through a process of collecting the information, modeling their targets, and getting the internal approval needed to set a target. Once companies are ready, they submit the target for validation by the SBTi, as I mentioned, with the idea of ensuring that all the key parameters that inform the target are in line with the SBTi criteria, and really to make sure that targets are meaningful and ambitious. After that, targets are announced publicly, and companies move into the implementation phase. And in the implementation phase, the expectation is for companies to review their targets on a periodic basis, and also to report progress against their targets on an annual basis. For the past couple of years, SBTi has assessed and communicated progress against science-based targets as part of our annual progress report. And we are right now working on a framework that is going to bring more clarity and structure around how we assess progress and compliance with science-based targets. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, in terms of the impact that we have so far on the coverage of science-based targets, right now we have nearly 3,700 companies that are in the process of setting science-based targets. Out of these, we have already 1,700 companies with targets approved, and the rest are in the process of developing their targets. Since the launch of the standard last year, the Net Zero standard, we have a large number of companies that are already committing to setting short-term and long-term net zero targets. And this number already represents over a third of the pipeline in the SBTi. If you go to the next slide, please. And in terms of the impact that this has in the wider economy, the first thing that I want to highlight is, as I mentioned, we have assessed progress for the last couple of years, and we are observing that companies that set science-based targets are actually embarking on a decarbonization trajectory. Based on the emissions that they disclose publicly, we have observed a reduction of 29% in average between 2015 and 2020 for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. The second impact metric that I want to highlight is companies cover around 1.5 gigatons of emissions across their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and of course, much more through their Scope 3. And so there's already a significant share of global emissions covered with science-based targets from companies. In terms of global market capitalization, we have over 1/3 of global market capitalization covered with science-based targets. And in terms of the geographical coverage, we have a lot of global companies in the pipeline, and these companies are headquartered in 70 different countries in all continents and across virtually every sector and every industry, and they act as a trigger for decarbonization in the global economy. So of course, these are very encouraging signals, but we also need to ensure that we scale up and accelerate adoption of science-based targets so that the global economy can meet this ambitious goal. You go to the next slide, please. Finally, I want to highlight some of the key projects that SBTi is working on in addition to the guidance that we're launching today. And the first piece of work that I want to highlight is next week, we're also launching the forestry, land, and agriculture guidance that covers basically land use related emissions, which is a key source of emissions globally. We are in the process of finalizing the guidance for shipping, which we expect to also launch in the next few weeks. And we are in earlier phases in the development of guidance for other key sectors, including oil and gas, steel, buildings, and chemicals. And also working on the development of the Net Zero standard for financial institutions and the MRV framework that will be applicable to both companies and financial institutions, amongst other projects that SBTi is currently working on. And you can find more information about all of these projects on the SBTi website that is available in the final slide. With that, I thank you all again for your time, and I hand over back to Ligia.
Thank you, Alberto, for sharing our progress to date and our accomplishments, and very excited to see what is ahead for us. And talking about accomplishments, I would like to invite Carl to tell us a little bit about our latest accomplishment. So the guidance for the cement sector to set science-based targets. So Carl, over to you now.
Thank you, Ligia. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So indeed, I want to spend a few minutes talking about why we've developed this cement guidance, how we've developed it, and most importantly, give you a high-level overview of what it contains. Before I do that, just on the next slide, I think it's worth highlighting that the cement and concrete sector is actually one of the most engaged in the heavy emitting sectors when it comes to setting science-based targets. So even before the publication of this guidance today, cement and concrete companies could set 2 degree or well below 2 degree targets. And this slide shows a non-exhaustive list of all of those cement and concrete companies that have already set targets who have committed to set targets. And in fact, the total volume of the emissions represented by these companies is actually around 20% of cement industry emissions. So we're reaching a tipping point for the cement industry. And we, of course, hope this share will continue to grow, and we expect it will with the launch of today's guidance. So on to the next slide, just to give you a little bit of background to this project. So as I said, before we launched this guidance, companies could already set well below 2 degree aligned targets using our tools. But we felt it was necessary to develop specific guidance for this sector for a few reasons. One was to increase the ambition to 1.5 degrees, which means we needed 1.5 degrees aligned pathways. Then also to offer more detailed target setting rules for companies in the sector so they understand what they need to do, and to align with the net zero standard and give guidance on both near-term and long-term targets. As already been mentioned, we would like to recognize and thank Holcim, who have been a key supporter and funder for this project. On the next slide, I just want to mention that one of the important parts of all of SBTi's resource development processes is the creation of an expert advisory group that accompanies the project. So the cement group can be seen on this slide, and the members here were carefully selected to provide a diverse balance of companies, NGOs, and academia, as well as a diverse balance of different geographies. So the role of this group is advisory, and the final sign-off on the deliverables was by the SBTi. So that means that the documents being published today don't necessarily represent the views of every single member of the expert advisory group, but I think a good level of consensus was reached on most of the main points. And then the final piece of context I want to give you is on the question we're sometimes asked, which is, does the cement sector in fact warrant a dedicated pathway and resources? And there are a number of reasons why we believe that it does. The first is that this is a large industrial sector and a large source of emissions, so therefore it's a priority area for the SBTi. The second reason is that modeling and data on cement is available in the literature for emission scenarios, such as from the IEA. It was feasible to develop a cement pathway. And then the final reason is that the emission scenarios that we base ourselves on, for example, from the IEA, they allocate the carbon budget between the different sectors through a balancing of the decarbonisation levers that are available to those sectors. So that means the size of the allocation of the budget to each sector depends on those levers and their cost compared to the same thing for other sectors. Here, the cement sector is a little bit specific due to the process or geogenic emissions from the decarbonisation of limestone in clinker production. The rate at which the sector will be able to decarbonise may be different from the overall rate of society as a whole. So it may be relevant, or it is relevant, to have a sector-specific pathway. The final thing I will say on this, though, is although the pathway that we're talking about here is on the level of cement, that doesn't mean that the guidance is not covering concrete production as well. In fact, we encourage concrete production, of course, to be included in targets, and I will explain a little bit more about that in a few moments. So now I would like to give a high-level overview of what the cement guidance covers. And if you are, of course, encouraged to read the resources that we're publishing today to find out all the details. So firstly, a few words of reassurance about what actually changes with this new guidance for companies that may already have set targets or companies that are used to reporting certain sustainability KPIs already. So this guidance actually just aims to codify and clarify criteria that were already being applied by the SBTi and by the companies setting targets. So the intention was not to invent new metrics or new criteria. The other intention was, of course, to align with the latest SBTi criteria and the net zero standard, as mentioned, and the 1.5 degree ambition. So this means that the definitions already being used by the industry remain aligned to industry practice. And there is, nevertheless, one major new requirement, which is that cement companies are required to have a near-term Scope 3 target covering purchased clinker and cement, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So the guidance takes the reader through 4 steps that they should be following to set targets for cement or concrete. The 4 steps are these on the screen. Determining your target boundaries and target setting approaches is step 1. Step 2 is calculating the emissions inventory for your company. Step 3 is about constructing your targets or combining different targets for different activities of your company. And step 4 is submitting your targets to the SBTi. So I'm going to give you a few highlights from each of these steps in the cement guidance in the next few slides. Step 1 is about the target boundaries. So for SBTi, for near-term targets, we already have generic criteria that don't change here, which say that at least 95% of Scope 1 and 2 emissions must be covered in your near-term targets. And if your company's Scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of the total Scope 1, 2, or 3, then a Scope 3 target is also required. However, what's new and more specific for the cement industry here is that we're adding an additional requirement, which is that a Scope 3 near-term target covering purchased cement and clinker is required. And the reason we wanted to implement this is so that the ambition level between companies mostly buying their clinker and cement and those mostly producing it is harmonized, and also to avoid a situation of what we can call scope leakage, whereby maybe a company that goes from producing most of their clinker to buying more of their clinker would see their emissions in Scope 1 going down, but there will be no corresponding rise in Scope 3 emissions if they didn't have a Scope 3 target. That's why it was important to cover this at the same ambition level. Then the other new element is not a requirement, but it is a recommendation, which is that cement companies should have a Scope 3 near-term target covering upstream emissions from the fuels that they use. And then finally, on long-term, there's no specific requirements here. The generic SBTi rule is that for long-term targets, Scope 1, 2, and 3 shall always be included. Then to talk a little bit about the target setting approaches that are available to us. So in SBTi, we have 2 main approaches. One is the sector-specific intensity convergence method, which is used for large homogeneous sectors, such as the cement sector. And here, the idea of the convergence method is that companies within the sector are converging towards a pathway that's in terms of intensity, so in terms of tons of CO2 per ton of cement in this case. And then for all other sectors that are not covered by a sector-specific pathway, we have the cross-sector absolute reduction method, whereby companies are expected to reduce their emissions at the same linear annual rate. So we go on to the next slide. We can have a look at what the new 1.5 degree pathway looks like for cement. So the graph on the left shows the Scope 1 emissions. The new 1.5 degree pathway is in the blue, compared to the well below 2 degree pathway in the orange, which is the one that has been used up till now. It might look at first that the new pathway is less ambitious than the old one in the years before around 2030, since more recent data means that the starting point is higher. But don't forget that companies are expected to converge towards this path by 2050. So in fact, the 1.5 degree pathway is always leading to more ambitious targets, even in the near term for companies. And then on the right, we have the Scope 2 pathway, which, even though in the 1.5 degree scenarios, we have increasing electricity demand due to electrification and carbon capture and storage in the cement industry, the decarbonization of the grid is faster, which means that the path is actually steeper than the older, well below 2 degree path that we were using. So let's look at what the pathways look like, which are on the level of cement. But if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how these are actually applied by different kinds of companies in the cement value chain. So here we have a representation of the cement value chain, from clinker production, cement production, concrete production, then of course, buildings and construction. And the core of this guidance is of course talking about clinker and cement production. But then if we go on to the next slide, the guidance also talks about how a typical large integrated producer that produces both cement and concrete would be able to use those two target setting methods to set targets for the clinker and cement production and also for their concrete production, and indeed for any other processes or activities that they have. Then if we go on to the next slide, we have the example of a company, a concrete company that is just producing concrete and is not producing its own clinker or cement and is buying the cement. There, the guidance shows how these companies who would typically have emissions which are just from fuels and electricities should use SBTi's cross-sector methods to cover their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then they can use the cement pathway to cover their scope 3 emissions for the cement that they buy. And that would be a similar situation for blending companies, which are cement companies that are buying the ingredients and blending to make cement. And then the final part of the value chain is buildings and construction, where we give guidance for how the cement pathway can be used for those kind of companies if they are buying cement. And here I do want to add an additional note, which is, of course, the cement pathway is in terms of emission reductions per unit of cement. So if these types of companies, in fact, want to reach their targets through optimizing or reducing how much cement they use per unit of concrete or how much concrete per unit of construction, then they might be better off following the generic absolute methods and setting targets on an absolute reduction basis. So then just going on to the step 3 or step 2, which is calculating your emissions inventory. Here, we, of course, as across SBTi, are following the greenhouse gas protocol. And we have, as well as that, some specific standards which are referred to. So the industry standard, the cement CO2 protocol, and the KPIs being used by the Global Cement and Concrete Association. So we're fully harmonized with company reporting here. For example, the intensity unit can be in terms of kilos of CO2 per ton of cementitious product. The emissions must be in terms of gross emissions, which means the emissions from the combustion of waste-derived fuels in cement production must be included in base year emissions and target year emissions. And then biogenic emissions is relatively well harmonized to industry practice, but of course the SBTi's specific criteria on bioenergy must also be followed in terms of reporting and your targets emission. Then the next step for a company would be to construct their targets. And here I won't go into any details, but the guidance offers detailed worked examples for different types of companies along the value chain for how they should use the different methods and combine the targets if they wish, and also how they should use the target setting tools that we provide. And then my final couple of slides here is about a few additional qualitative requirements that have been set for when companies submit their targets to the SBTi. So the first one of these is a requirement. It's the requirement that companies must provide a justification of the growth projection that they use to calculate their targets. The reason for this is that we had heard from stakeholders that some companies were using a different growth projection in their calculations than what they were disclosing elsewhere. And of course, how your company is going to grow will change what your target should be. So that's important that those numbers are correct. And then the second point on the slide here is a recommendation rather than a requirement. It's dealing with the point that we know that in this sector, some of the technologies or many of the technologies that will be used to get towards net zero, including carbon capture and storage, are breakthrough technologies. And in order to enhance the credibility of targets, companies should disclose how they are investing in these technologies so that they will be ready in the time frame required by the target that they're setting. And then finally, one other recommendation to companies setting targets. Since I've mentioned before that, of course, in the cement and concrete industry, optimizing or reducing how much cement is used in concrete may be a very valid decarbonization lever for companies, but may not be captured in their target if their target is set on the basis of tons of CO2 per ton of cement. Companies may want to consider publishing the absolute emission reductions that are associated with their target in order to be able to demonstrate progress using that lever as well. So that brings me to the end of my brief overview of what the guidance contains, and I'll hand back to Ligia.
Thanks, Carl, and congratulations to you and to the whole team for the great work. Very happy to see more companies in the cement sector setting science-based targets. And speaking of it, I would like to invite Antonio Carrillo from Holcim to share the company's experience in this SBTi journey. So, Antonio, very glad to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lydia. As already said, my name is Antonio. I'm responsible for climate and energy at Holcim. It's really great to be here with you, sharing our experience with the Science Based Target Initiative, and I'm really excited to see the result of this engagement. I think we can go to the next slide. Just few facts about Holcim for those who don't know who we are. We're a leading company in the building materials industry. We're present in 4 main segments: cement manufacturing, ready mix, aggregates, and solution and products, like for example roofing. And our footprint is a large one, with more than 2,000 sites and more than 70,000 employees. It's a company where sustainability and decarbonization aspects is truly embedded now in the DNA and the process, and as well as to work in innovation, innovative solutions to decarbonize the built environment. So actually, I'm today talking from our R&D center in Lyon, where more than 300 colleagues are here working on developing lower carbon solutions as we talk. But if we can go to the next slide, just to sort of set the scene, I think I just wanted to mention the fact that Holcim and in general the cement industry has been working on decarbonization for a while, right? There's an 8H that happened. So Holcim has reduced emissions since the 90s, but there was a point a few years ago where our stakeholders needed to have some sort of backup and confidence whether the goals that the organization has were actually backed up by science, no? And that's a little bit how we came across the Science Based Target Initiative and start to collaborate together, really to formalize those commitments. And obviously during the process, we've been challenging the level of ambition that the company has. And we've been basically increasing that level of ambition and pushing harder towards decarbonization. It's true that it also helped a lot that the industry under the umbrella of the Global Cement and Concrete Association had a strong history of transparency. So we've been reporting our Scope 1 emissions, which is you'll see in a sec, so most material source of emissions for many years, and there's a robust process of checking quality of the data, and that definitely has supported the process to sort of speed it. And as Cal was saying, you see there's a critical mass already happening within the sector of companies engaging towards decarbonization goals that are backed up by SBTi. But I just tried to put a little bit the chronological order of our engagement in the next slide, if you may. I found it quite interesting when putting this together. It looked, it sounds like it was yesterday, but to me it felt like a decade. So it's true that we started in 2019 with the validation of our target at the time, which was aligned with the 2-degree scenario. And obviously we started engaging in the process in 2020. With the context of the pandemic, we signed the business ambition for 1.5 and engaged with Science Based Target Initiative to have our first near-term targets validated as a well below 2-degree scenario, which was the latest science available at the time in terms of models. And there was a bit of a contradiction between the 1.5 ambition and the existing targets methods to validate those near-term targets. And that's how the partnership came up to really support the initiative to develop that the guidelines that we are presenting today. They are presenting today, so very excited to have it really contributed to this milestone. Last year, we were also very excited to be part of the process of testing the net zero standard, and very lucky to be among the first companies that have validated its net zero targets by 2050 across all the 3 scopes, and that's something I like to insist here to highlight, because it's been fundamental for the sort of a mindset change within the organization. But not last but not least, today we are obviously launching the guidelines of the 1.5 degree, the result of this partnership, and would like to thank, as Carl said, the support of all the colleagues that have actually been working on it, also as part of the expert advisory group. And Holcim has already sort of engaged in the validation process to upgrade as soon as possible our goals to this latest reference document. In the next slide, please. Yeah, I would like to show a little bit what has meant for us this engagement. As I was saying, along the process, we've basically been expanding our focus. So there's a reason why Holcim and in general the industry has been focusing on scope 1 emissions. 75% of our footprint is coming from that source of emissions. Almost 50% alone, it's actually coming from the decarbonation of the raw materials in the process that we need to sort of make to produce clinker, which is the core material of cement and therefore concrete. There is a good portion, 25% from the combustion needed to reach those temperatures. Around 5% on the scope 2 emissions from the purchased electricity, and 20% on the scope 3 emissions. And that was something we were not looking at. And I think as a result of this engagement, it really expanded our view, and it was very interesting what happened within the company. There were functions, there were departments, colleagues that were not engaged in the journey, and it helped a lot to sort of bring all these drive together. So procurement teams, logistic teams, our drivers, everyone is really engaged on getting to these goals. And that's one of the sort of main engagement aspects that happen sort of from a mindset perspective internally as a result of this process with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But in the next slide, I would also like to show some other aspects that we felt were important to present you. And apologies for repeating myself, because some of you might have seen already that slide in the previous webinar we did in April when we were doing the public consultation. But this engagement with SBTi and the validation of our goals through them has been fundamental to bring resilience or credibility to our journey from a number of angles. The no-brainer is probably the ESG ratings, right? So it's a number of ESG ratings, CDP, but also MSCI and many others, which are now sort of requiring to have your goals validated by SBTi in order to sort of keep on leadership positions or to reach leadership positions on those ratings, which is at the same time extremely important for some investors to show and to demonstrate that you are doing the right things. And that's a little bit how also some of these aspects that I just shared initiated, but it suddenly it unlocked a number of other exciting opportunities, such as, for example, partnerships. We were approached by MIT. We are now a founding member of the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium. As a result of that engagement, when we signed the Business Ambition 1.5, so really credible partners we're exploring companies that have engaged or validated their targets with SBTi is something that we have seen as an unlocking opportunity. Customers, suppliers within the supply chain, more and more demanding on SBTs in order to sort of do business with. It's something we are definitely seeing as an increasing trend. And of course, as I mentioned, investors, right? So for you engage with investors, you know what I'm talking about. Really increasing in number of requests to align with SBTs, to the latest science from investors community, at least on Holcim, and which is also something that has linked to great opportunities in sustainable finance through the launch of sustainability linked bonds and sort of the whole financial community is bringing a little bit this ecosystem together where SBTs are becoming fundamental. And that's a little bit our experience. I think I'm going to stop here. If we can go to the next slide just to conclude. But again, really, it's been great having been able to support SBTi in this process, and really thanks to all the people that made it possible, to the expert advisory group, and at Holcim we're very excited to looking forward to next steps in this engagement. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Antonio. Very happy to learn more about the Holcim's case. And starting the second part of our webinar, I would like to invite Antonio and Carl for this Q&A section. So we have been systematizing some of your questions here to answer them live. So I would like to start with a question for Carl. So is it correct that the emission intensity does not need to go to zero? And what are the reasons? Is that including recarbonation?
Thank you for the question. So indeed, we say that for nearly all for many sectors, there will still be a small amount of what we call residual emissions when they reach their target year, their long-term target year, which must be by 2050 or sooner. So this small amount of residual emissions, it's usually less than 10% of today's emissions. And what that exact amount is comes from the emission scenarios that we get from the IEA. And the reason this residual emissions exist for industries such as cement is that even if there's a technology like carbon capture and storage that could, in theory, capture all of emissions, it doesn't mean that it's going to be able to be applied to every plant. And also we have to take into account the fact that the cost of each additional ton that you abate as you get closer and closer to net zero is more and more expensive. So you're likely to end up with this residual emissions. However, we encourage companies to make very steep reductions within their value chain to meet their SBT before their long-term target. And then once they're at that long-term target, they do need to commit to dealing with these residual emissions through removals, which may be within or outside of their value chain. And then to answer the second part of the question, whether recarbonation, that is the uptake of CO2 naturally by cement and concrete, is included. It's not included in the pathways, so it should not be included in base year emissions or target year emissions, as it's not really a lever that can be used for companies that want to achieve their targets. What we did discuss in the expert advisory group was whether it can be a lever for neutralizing those residual emissions once the long-term target is reached, and that's something that we've left a little bit open for further discussion in future, as it does not affect target setting right now or indeed achievement of near-term targets.
Perfect. Thanks, Carl. And I have now a question for Antonio, and it's a long one. So does the 1.5C pathway assume that there will be a technological solution to calcination process emissions? If so, how has this been estimated, and at what point will it be revisited should this technology not materialize? And how does Holcim feel about this?
Thanks for the question. Great question. So obviously we're today about I've been presenting the sort of the target setting process, but as rightly said, it's not all about targets, but how are we going to get there, right? So at Holcim, we've recently this year disclosed our first climate transition report that was presented to our shareholders for vote and feedback, where we explain how we plan to get to reach those targets and estimated, as you rightly were saying in the question, what contribution of the different levers we're going to actually impact. Breakthrough technologies such as carbon capture and storage, or even novel binders, it's going to play a key role, especially after the 2030 near-term targets. And that's why it's important to test all those technologies in this decade to make sure. No, so with regards to carbon capture, we're definitely testing more than 30 pilots. 6 of them are already publicly available. few of them have received public funding. So now it's time to really test those technologies and reiterate that process as we progress, rather than waiting until sort of 2032 to do something. But yeah, we really plan to scale up those technologies to test them first, and obviously to be reiterating on other aspects that might come across. But I think it's really important to that question, to really that assessment. What is the potential decarbonization levers? And I think the industry has done a great job through the Global Cement and Concrete Association. There is a very clear roadmap that sort of summarizes a bit the expectations of all the regions, where even regional companies or associations have been involved in development. So there will be a lot of more feedback on details on that question on those documents.
Perfect. Thanks, Antonio. And now I have a question for both of you. So can you talk more about how offsets can or cannot be used in net zero targets within this guidance? And what does residual mean? Would Holcim share how they are thinking about offsets within their strategy? So for both of you.
Yeah, so I can start on that one. So as Alberto explained in his slides, according to the net zero standard, what we call beyond value chain mitigation or offsets or compensation is outside the boundary of your science-based target, which means we're prioritizing real emission reductions within your value chain to the level that is required by the guidance. Beyond value chain mitigation, that is, offsets, can still be done in the meantime and are a good way to encourage decarbonization actions outside of your value chain in society as a whole. And then once you reach this very low residual level of emissions at your long-term target year, which is defined for each sector in our documents, then you are also allowed to use outside of your value chain removals to reach that net zero level. So this is to make it very clear that we need urgent emission reductions, not through offsets, to reach those very low levels. So we're not relying on offsets to reach our science-based targets, but they can be an additional action.
I can take it on the Holcim side. Really, not much to say. We're not working actively on offsetting. To be quite transparent, there is a bit of offsetting in the product level. So sometimes for certain certifications, LEED, BREEAM, some of our customers opt for offsetting the unabated emissions of a certain product that has been already sort of reduced in terms of embodied carbon through circularity aspects, and we can offer that service for the customer to claim those, but we do not sort of claim those offsets in our inventory of emissions, and not actively working on offsetting at this stage.
Thanks, Antonio and Carl. And I have a question here for Carl. That seems to be basic, but actually it's very important. So is the guidance mandatory or just recommended?
Thanks for the question. So the publication of this guidance does not oblige any companies to update their targets if they have targets already, or to set targets if they don't. However, we do encourage companies to up their ambition. So if they have well below 2 degrees targets, they should be thinking about updating to 1.5. Nevertheless, it doesn't oblige it. As I said, the normal target update timeframe is 5 years, or if there are significant changes in your company, that would mean you need a target recalculation.
Perfect. Thanks, Carl. And I think we have time for one last question here for Antonio. So could you list some examples of Scope 3 categories that you include in your GHG inventory and your current targets? And why was it important for you to include this?
Sure. So well, I think let me start with why it was important. As I mentioned, and I think it's totally fair. We were initially a few years back, the industry, Holcim was was also focused on mainly on Scope 1 emissions, and I think through this engagement with SBTi in the process, we sort of expanded that view and sort of started engaging more with the value chain. So that's been very much appreciated by our customers, by our suppliers, but also there is a number of increasing number of requests about looking more holistically at the footprint of the company. So that's how we sort of initiated the work in there. We've been reporting those in, for example, the CDP. Main categories we're reporting are fuels and energy, so emissions from the fuels that we consume, clinker and cement that we purchase from third parties, which already was mentioned by Carl as one of the key elements of these guidelines, but all the bulk materials as well, could be slag or fly ash, or chemicals, additives that we can use in ready mix production or in the new segment that we are developing on product solution and products, but also logistics. When it comes to transportation, we have upstream transportation and downstream transportation. There is also a bit of business travel and commuting, but it's sort of negligible compared to the other categories. And in terms of size, so the three main upstream activities are fuels and energy, clinker and cement that we purchase. And on the other side is really the downstream transportation. And that's why those are the three sort of main categories we focus to set up near-term targets. And where we are basically working more closely with our teams in the countries, in the regions, the sites, and our supply chain on actions to decarbonize.
Thanks, Antonio, and thanks, Carl and Antonio, for this Q&A section. I think we have to finish now, but just to say that any questions that have remained unanswered will be followed up by email by our team in the next days. So I think we are approaching the end of our day here. I just would like to see the slides again. Yes, thank you. So the next one, please. So I would like to let you know that the new guidance and materials, as well as the recording of this webinar, can be found on the SBTi Cement webpage in our website. So everything is there. And we have very good news about a group of leading cement companies that have committed to submitting 1.5C targets by the end of this month, according to the new guidance for validation before COP27. We have a group of 4 to 5 companies that are already submitting their targets, and we still have 1 or 2 slots available. So if you are a company in the cement sector and want to have your target aligned to 1.5C validated before COP, please let us know by the end of this week, and we will try to make it happen. And also, if you are a company that is in the pipeline, so validating your targets aligned with well below 2C, and you want to upgrade the ambition of your target to 1.5C, glad to help you as well, and we will charge no extra fee for that. So let us know as soon as possible as well. And we are now in the end of our event, and as science says, we need action that is now and very ambitious. And now the SBTi is providing companies in the cement sector with methods, tools, and guidance for that. So commit to the SBTi, set your target, and join this group of leading companies that are paving this way. Very happy to be here with you today. Hope to see you soon. Ciao, ciao.